Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you the Mistweaver Buffs, the latest changes on 9.1's PTR for the healers. Starting to go over what's been going on, how they're feeling, what's been changing about them, all that good stuff. Alright, so we've got Mistweaver Buffs on the way, with Tiger Palm, Blackout Kick, and a Rising Sun Kick all getting 10% damage buffs, okay? Basically, all the abilities are going to be proccing Ancient Teachings of the Monastery, a very popular Mistweaver Legendary. So that's going to be interesting. And Spinning Crane Kick getting a 20% damage buff. So not only looking to provide some buffs, of course, for the single target side, but also some more for the AoE, which was desperately in need. You know, spinning last expansion, you'd be able to just top off everybody in your group thanks to the uncapped AoE and everything, as well as the synergy with Way of the Crane. Now, Spinning Crane Kick is just a shell of its former self, so having that buff is sorely needed. But these buffs for their damage don't really provide enough competition, in my opinion, towards Holy Paladin, which did notably get about a 10% damage nerf recently with 9.1. But when they're so substantially far ahead of everybody in terms of damage, and Mistweaver is the second melee healer, you know, Pally being the first, so you need to be able to find some kind of way to sort of shake up that meta, you know? And in true form, we see these buffs coming in like Enveloping Mist, mana cost reduced. So, yay, a little bit of a mana cost reduction for Envelop is nice, because Envelop's been a very large part of Mistweaver's healing from Enveloping Breath, or from Tear of Morning's Legendary and the Enveloping transfers that you can get out of those. That's been very helpful. So, sure, that helps just a little bit, but what we're really looking for is something to shake up the meta and be able to shake up what classes are going to be brought to the raid and everything. And then tacked onto that, Revival's healing is reduced by 10%, but Revival now procs Gust of Mist on each target healed, so you could basically Essence Font in advance and then get your Revival cast off, right? All well and good. So in the end, Revival still will be a net buff. There's net buffs across the board for the spec, but I think in a lot of cases we're really missing the most notable thing, is that this 0.1 patch so far has been, from a healer perspective, a lot more of a reinforcement of the current meta rather than any sort of shift or change or adjustment, right? Some of the primary problems that Mistweaver really has are being the only caster of sorts in a melee range. And when it comes to Paladin, you know, a lot of Pallies were hurting because of that Crusader's Might nerf, where, of course, the cooldown reduction that they're getting from Crusader's Might, Crusader Striking, and everything like that got reduced from a 1.5 seconds to 1 second with last week's changes. So now at this point, you know, they might have to cast a couple spells here and there in melee, and Mistweaver has just already been doing that for such a long period of time, and it's very frustrating for the spec when you're looking at, you know, oh, I gotta stop and cast. Oh, I'm on Sludge Fist. I got a Chains partner. Okay, I need to be running with them at all times. I need to plan out all my casts so I can be, when I have to move, I'm Essence Fonting. When I have to move, casting, you know, Renewing Mists or something like that to be able to fill in that dead time, or I'm attacking with my Ancient Teachings window or something like that, right? So you have to do all this extra planning, and it really reduces your melee uptime on the boss, whereas as long as Paladin can follow the boss and hit the boss, they're still able to do almost their entire, you know, output just based off of that. Of course, that might change in 9.1 a little bit, but so much of it is instant, it's mobile, it's easy. Mistweaver, on the other hand, doesn't have anything crazy like Devotion Aura, raid-wide 15% damage reduction on everybody that they're able to take advantage of. They don't have that infinite mobility that Paladin's able to bring to the table, you know? Mistweaver does have some stellar defensives, and their damage is improving, but again, we're looking at that comparison to how does that square up against another melee healer. There's not really any penalty to having double Paladins in progression, and I think that that sort of factor doesn't really weigh down on the devs very much when they're looking at this sort of balance changes. If anything, I feel like when I look at the PvP changes and PvP upgrades and updates and everything, the PvPers are getting the cooler abilities, and it seems like they're just getting meta shifts of sorts, much more than PvE is for the healer department, you know? But who knows? Holy Pally, of course, Inflorescence of the Sunwell, the rune carving power legendary that nobody uses, gives a 30% chance at a Holy Light to generate 2 Holy Power when it consumes Infusion of Light. Huzzah! Don't really think that it's going to be getting too many changes right now. But let's not forget, we do have new runic carving powers for Mistweaver. These are the Covenant-based ones. Your abilities have a low chance to cast Bone Dust Brew at your target's location. Honestly, Bone Dust Brew doesn't really do all that much healing as is. So that's unfortunate. I'd be curious if it would proc Imeni's Lead by Example. That'd be interesting. Maybe get an intellect buff out of it. But again, would you give up Ancient Teachings of the Monastery or Tear of Mourning, depending on your playstyle? Probably not. Not for this. Call to Arms, Weapons of Order calls forth Yu'lon. This is actually kind of interesting. I mean, you can basically have a 3-minute CD out of Yu'lon and then a 2-minute CD out of Yu'lon of sorts when Weapons of Order is up. But again, that's crazy mana costly. So are you going to use that over your other legendary options? Again, probably not. Phaeline Harmony. Your abilities have a chance to reset. Phaeline Stomp is doubled. Enemies and allies hit by Phaeline are affected by Phae exposure, increasing your damage and healing against them by 8%. Well, if you could pair this up with Ancient Teachings of the Monastery, and then you can have an extra damage boost that would also transfer into more healing, that'd be interesting. But, again, not going to be quite the play. Because, again, you've got to be able to take this legendary and replace it over what you currently have. Fallen Order summons an additional adept for 24 seconds. So while you have one of the active adepts, your abilities that critically hit reduce the CD of Fallen Order. Again, nobody's really playing Venthyr. I do wish that there was a bit more interaction with all these legendaries with the Mistweaver spec in general, but we just don't really sort of see that at all. So it's unfortunate in that regard. I think Mistweaver right now definitely needs an update, and it needs to start in the talent department, and it needs to start in the Celestials, okay? Right now, a lot of people have been talking about, like, oh, they're going to revamp Monk. They're going to bring it back. They're going to change all these things. And I really don't want them to change a ton of what Mistweaver is about. But I do want to change their supporting cooldowns. Right now, if you take, for example, Refreshing Jade Wind, which is, of course, a very efficient and very useful ability, you also are just starving for mana when it starts coming right down to how you're going to be interacting with Enveloping Breath and the Celestial window and everything like that, right? So you can say, hey, I'm going to take Refreshing Jade Wind, and then you have Yu'lon as your Celestial. And to make the most out of Yu'lon, you got to be casting Enveloping Mists during the Celestial window, which then triggers Enveloping Breath, which does tons of healing, right? So there already needs to be people low because it's a very powerful, very strong hot that it would cast, right? So you're consuming a lot of mana out of RJW, you're consuming a lot of mana out of all these Enveloping Mist casts, and you're kind of just easily running out of gas. When I play Red Crane, for example, on Sire Denathrius, I have a plethora of mana at my disposal, and I actively use it to fit in more Envelopings to heal in my tank, get the extensions out of Rising Mist, all that great stuff, right? Which is very helpful. But you sort of shift from, I'm just hitting Essence Font and dealing some damage with RJW and trying to get a couple of envelops off during my Yu'lon, and I'm just like dying for mana with no innervates, right? And then I switch over to Red Crane and I just have so much mana that I have to be like super active about just spending it, right? Because you're not burning it on RJW. You have the cost reduction if you want it out of Red Crane, and sometimes, you know, phase 1 of Sire, for example, I just won't actually deal any damage for the cost reduction. I'll just straight up cast Enveloping Mists all the time because I have the mana to work with. So it's that sort of issue, that sort of dichotomy that Mistweaver really has going into it that drives me insane, because you just have this sort of shift between, hey, I'm burning all my mana, and hey, I have tons of mana at my disposal, and you still don't have damage reduction. You have excellent defensives for yourself, but what about the rest of the raid? Symbol of Hope, I think, was a very heartening start, where Symbol of Hope for Holy Priest would give the defensive cooldowns back of different players in the raid, and that's a neat little utility that can be added. I think it's a little too weak at the moment, but it's a neat utility that is added, and I think that needs to happen for Mistweavers, and it can happen in the form of Celestials, right? Does it give cooldown reduction back to people for their offensive CDs? Does it give an aura of versatility or something along those lines? So you have some damage reduction, and then you have some bonus damage that you're adding to everybody. How can they make that Celestial start weaving in and be more powerful for the entirety of the group, right? Is it when Yu'lon spawns, there's going to be a bit of a delay or stagger effect onto the raid? Everybody who's stacked nearby the Mistweaver, for example, they'll only take 70% of the damage up front, and then the rest will become a dot onto everybody, right? What are the different ways that they can actually adjust that? And I know it's not something that's gonna boom happen overnight, but this is something that needs to happen for the spec. It needs to happen for Rested Druid as well. I don't want to leave the Ard-Druid bros out, but these secondary type of utilities that are unique, interesting, and valuable in a variety of situations has defined PvE rating for a very long time. And we still haven't quite seen any sort of updates on that. So I'm hoping Mistweaver can get some changes. To sum up as well, for Discipline, they had their rune carving powers updated here. Most notably, Shadow Word Manipulation no longer grants an additional charge. You might have recalled from the last video, I was pretty excited about this. And then they decided to remove it after one raid test. So, bit unfortunate on my part, that's for sure. I know it says it lasts 3,000 seconds, but Mind Games last an additional 3 seconds. So it's now a 10-second duration to Mind Games, and reverses an additional 10% damage or healing. Now this might sound like the Conduit, but it's actually worse, okay? The Conduit itself increases the upfront damage of Mind Games. This only increases the reversal effects, not the upfront damage that converts into Atonement Healing. So when Mind Games ends, you gain 3% critical strike for each second remaining for 10 seconds, okay? If you have 1 second remaining, you get 3%. If you have 2 seconds, you get 6%, and on and on and on, okay? So how does Mind Game end, okay? Well, if its duration runs off, then you get no crit bonus. So Mind Games will end if it's dispelled, which of course is PvP oriented, or if the enemy that you attack both does damage to your friends and tries to heal itself or another enemy, okay? And there's literally 2 bosses in Castle Nathria that do that. It's Hungry Destroyer during Consume, and it's P1 Sire, right? So those are the only times that Mind Games actually ends in a PvE environment. So far, I've tested all the bosses in Sanctum of Domination that have been available to me. There's still about a little over half of the Mythic bosses that have yet to be tested. So unless I'm missing something on Mythic, there's been no bosses that actually try to heal and damage. So at that point, you're really not going to be able to get a Mind Games cancel and additional crit bonus or anything like that. And if you do, then you're not going to have it for Schism. You're not going to have it for the Mind Games because you just cast that. So you're having a crit bonus for your Penance and for your Mind Blast. Neither of which is what I'd really, call insane amounts of extra damage. So having a crit on it would be marginal at best. And keep in mind, you're giving up clarity of mind as well. Extremely, extremely unfortunate. I think Shadow Manipulation is dead on arrival. Once somebody's pact, of course, got updated. You enter a pact with the Death Loa, calling forth a haunted mask that lingers on a target until Fey Guardians ends. Copies the benefit of the current fairy on its target, follows your direct mask. Well, I'm not sure what a direct mask is, but the way that this sounds to me is that it copies the benefit of what you already have on that target. So I don't know exactly how it would work if you would have damage reduction and cooldown reduction on the same target, if it would copy both, or if it just amplifies one of them. So if it just amplifies one of them, then yay, your 100% cooldown reduction becomes 200%, your 20% damage reduction becomes 40%, and so on and so forth. That being said, however, when we're looking at, are you going to give up Flash Concentration for this, right? Are you going to run with Night Fae for your M+ squad, and then sacrifice running Venthyr for your raid squad, right? Those things start to be a lot more complicated. And honestly, I'm not expecting that much out of Bonsami's pack, unless we're looking at Chinese Warcraft logs. Spheres of Harmony got confirmed as a legendary, is what I talked about last week. This, again, could have some potential with Mechanicos or Mykonos, the steward man on the Kyrian side, once you unlock that capstone trait, which will give you even more cooldown reduction. Just in general, I mean, this would be pretty good for M+, if you're a Kyrian player that wants to do M+ as disc, right? It could certainly be very useful on its own, but it gets even better and even more consistent, and potentially for a raid environment as well, if you also have Mechanicos' capstone trait to follow up with it. So at that point, you only unlock that capstone trait like 6 to 8 weeks after the patch launches. It's a lot of renown you got to get before you can actually get that final trait for your 3rd Soulbind. But once you do, then yeah, you could actually have some legs for M+. Less consistent, of course, in raids, because sometimes you're going to be able to get to that 30 stack mark with Boon of the Ascended, and other times you might be spamming Ascended Nova on a single target, and that is not something you want to be doing whatsoever, because that's also going to be interfering with your ramp window, right? So it sort of adds more complications to it. Right now, Disc is very, very much bound to Mind Games, and losing out on the additional Mind Games charge, I do think is a big hit to the spec, because going into the new tier, to think that the double charges just gave you some more flexibility, and that was something the spec sorely needed, because you're very rigid in needing to have Mind Games for, you know, the biggest ramp that you're going to be able to have. So if you still have Spirit Shell gameplay going on, there's going to be a lot of focus, of course, on having Mind Games up for every single Spirit Shell, which can work sometimes, but the damage timers are not always 45-second intervals, and sometimes they're a little bit less than that, so that makes it even harder to be able to time Mind Games, and you might be going with some ramps without a Mind Games charge, which feels really, really bad. So, going forward, I'm not super thrilled about the state of Discipline. I think that the new tier, there's been some decent fights for it, but it is just a harder and more frustrating version of Castle Nathria by a significant margin. Things just feel much more difficult to be able to put together solid ramps, solid timers, and solid consistency on when the damage is going to be happening for you to be able to reverse it or absorb it or whatnot. Both playing with Rapture and Evangelism as well as Spirit Shell, neither side feels amazing and very enjoyable to play at the moment, even though the raid fights have been pretty good. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any sort of questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Of course, we'll be adding more updates as we are going to be streaming our raid POV on Thursday and Friday for more Mythic bosses. So be sure to check them out. Link in the description below. Thank you for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it and found it useful. Let me know what you think, and I'll catch you all next time.